The committee will come to order. The committee will now consider H.R. 3308, the Taxpayers Transparency Act of 2013. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 3308, a bill to require a Federal agency to include language in certain educational and advertising materials indicating that such materials are produced and disseminated at taxpayer expense.
Without objection, H.R. 3308 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any time. Mr. Farenthold.
I have an amendment at the table in the nature of a substitute.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3308 offered by Mr. Farenthold of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text of the has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas for an opening statement on his amendment.
Thank you very much. The base bill and the amendment in the nature of a substitute requires that the Federal Government disclose that advertisements and information on government programs and services that are put out in the media, notices there that they're paid for by the taxpayer. This is a good government bill, so we know how our tax dollars are being spent, whether something is an advertisement or a public service announcement and the like. Advertisements provide information, but in many instances they're designed to induce people to buy or use a product or service. While we can debate whether individual Federal advertising campaigns are overly promotional, surely we can agree that the public should know when they're sponsoring a government marketing piece. Americans deserve to know how their tax dollars are being spent, and this bill adds needed transparency to the business of government by requiring disclosure when dollars are spent on advertising and other materials. What we're doing in the amendment is we're closing a loophole that felt like was in the original bill by requiring the label "at taxpayer expense" to be added to materials produced or disseminated as opposed to "and" in the original bill. We're also going to allow agencies to substitute the phrase "funded by the United States government" instead of "funded at taxpayer expense" when the communication is entirely funded by user fees. This would recover, for instance, materials from the Patent and Trademark Office. It also requires the OMB to issue guidance 6 months after the date of enactment. We also eliminate an exception that the introduced bill did not require funded at taxpayer expense on civilian job advertisements, and we felt like we might as well go ahead and include those as well. And we finally make it clear that the bill is not subject to judicial review. This is similar to language that was included in the plain writing bill. What we're trying to do here is not necessarily shut off judicial review, but prohibit frivolous lawsuits. We feel like government agencies will abide by the law without having to be sued to do so. We can continue to enforce that ourselves through the oversight process and through the appropriations process and other ways where we don't open the government up to needlessly having to defend lawsuits and further wasting taxpayer dollars. So I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We now go to the ranking member for the ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and your staff for working with the minority to make improvements to the underlying bill. This amendment includes several key changes. It clarifies that the requirements of the bill only apply to communications produced after the date of the enactment. It would be ridiculous to make agencies reprint documents that have already been produced. The amendment also requires the Office of Management and Budget to issue guidance to agencies within 6 months of enactment. This will help clarify for agencies which communications are covered by the bill and what steps the agency must take to comply. The amendment also includes language clarifying that an agency can't be challenged in court for its compliance or noncompliance with the bill. This amendment does not include all of the minority suggestions. For example, we suggested that agencies include the phrase, quote, "paid for by the United States government," end of quote, rather than, quote, "printed at taxpayer expense." Mr. Chairman, I hope you will consider making that change if this bill moves on to the floor. Some agencies receive funds from direct sources, such as fees rather than taxpayer funds. That change would be a simple way of ensuring that agencies provide an accurate description of how a communication is funded. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield to the gentlelady, Ms. Duckworth.
I thank the ranking member. Mr. Chairman, I have a concern with the underlying bill that I'd like to raise. We know that some military recruiting materials include statements indicating that they are paid for by the United States Army or other relevant branch. I just want to make sure that the military, this would not negatively affect the military, because for their recruiting materials would actually say paid for by the U.S. Army, Navy, et cetera. Similarly, with the Department of Veterans Affairs, they have quite a large number of materials that are paid for by the Department of Veterans Affairs for example, mental health outreach. I think that there is a difference between the statement printed at taxpayer expense as opposed to paid for by the Department of Veterans Affairs in terms of garnering trust among those veterans whom we're trying to reach and get them to come forward to use those VA services. Would you be willing to work with me as this bill goes forward to make sure that there are no unintended consequences that may negatively impact recruitment of our armed forces and cause unnecessary cost to DOD or to the Department of Veterans Affairs?
Will the gentlelady yield?
I will. I yield.
I think one of the things we're trying to do in the amendment in the nature of a substitute by allowing the OMB to issue regulations on how that's implemented is that could be done. The idea is to get as much information as possible without confusing the public. Obviously, these agencies are, for the most part, funded with taxpayer dollars. So, that's the idea behind it. The only concern I would have is as you get into an alphabet soup of federal agencies, funded by.
Right.
You pick the alphabet soup, you don't necessarily know if that's a government agency or a private agency, and we don't want to get that level of confusion in there as well. But I certainly have no problem working with you, but I do think that even as is, the OMB regulations will meet your concerns.
Well, I appreciate your willingness to work with me, and I would love to, we'll get together afterwards.
If the gentlelady would further yield.
I yield, Mr.
I would
Chairman.
join with my colleague from Texas in saying we'd enjoy working with you to make sure that we make it very clear so as not to discriminate or cause veterans or military not to be involved. So I think we can find the best case language together.
Thank you. I yield back to the ranking member.
I now recognize myself briefly. Really to respond to the ranking member, the language of the bill currently does allow for language other than taxpayer expense when, in fact, it is other than taxpayers. It is the majority's view that if it is wholly paid for by taxpayers, the term taxpayer is better than implying that somehow the government has money other than taxpayers. However, we would be happy to work with the minority to make sure that if there is middle ground language that allows the best case to be used in all cases to explain to people the source of the document and so on, we'd be happy to work with the minority.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that, and I look forward to working with you.
Thank you. Does any other member wish to speak on the bill? Does any member wish to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there is no further discussion, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I now move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report the bill H.R. 3308 to the House with the recommendation that it do pass as amended. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 3308 to the House as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 3308 is reported to the House as amendment. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make necessary and conforming technical changes and to refine such language as may have been agreed to here. Without objection, so ordered. The committee will now consider H.R. 4011, the Alaskan Bypass Fair Competition Act. The clerk, please designate the bill.
H.R. 4011, a bill to amend Title 39 United States Code to improve the efficiency and competitiveness of mail service within the State of Alaska.
Without objection, H.R. 4011 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I now recognize myself for a short opening statement. And I first ask unanimous consent that the letter dated February 10, 2013, from Congressman Don Young be placed in the record. Without objection, so ordered. H.R. 4011 modifies the Alaskan Bypass Program to help encourage greater competition and bring savings to the Post Office and rural Alaskans. With large regions of the State inaccessible by road, and in fact, roads are not built there, the Alaskan Bypass Mail Program provides a key service by connecting rural Alaskans to the rest of the nation. Under this program, the Postal Service transfers mail to a number of private air carriers without the State, throughout the State, and the air carriers are then responsible for final delivery. I must take a moment to ask all members who are not currently familiar with bypass mail to become familiar with bypass mail. Bypass mail is a term which is often misunderstood. Bypass mail is not mail. Bypass mail is, in fact, freight. It can be jugs of milk. It can be fresh fruits and vegetables. It can be a Honda generator. They are placed on pallets and delivered most often as air freight would normally be delivered. The modification of this bill is because under current construction, the program disincentivized competition, driving costs to the Postal Service ultimately higher. Since the rate of payment is based on a reduced rate compared to parcel post, any additional costs are passed on to the ratepayers throughout all 50 States. The bill is intended to help reduce those incentives by eliminating a permanent grandfathering preference for only those airlines operating in Alaska since January 1, 2001. As you can all imagine, a lot has happened since January 2001. By resetting the date, we give an opportunity under the bill for companies who have been continuously operating in Alaska as an Alaskan carrier for 3 years or more. This is carefully intended to not disrupt the Alaskan preference for companies which operate throughout the entire year. In short, the bill intends to protect against someone going up only during a peak season for a month or two and then leaving Alaska. That is a concern of Alaskans. It's one that I share because, in fact, air service throughout Alaska is necessary 12 months out of the year. In many cases, it is the only way to reach rural locations. And I now recognize Mr. Cummings to make his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The Postal Service continues to face significant financial difficulties, and comprehensive bipartisan postal reform legislation is urgently needed. Although the postal legislation before us today may be well-intentioned, it is not comprehensive, and it will do very little, if anything, to place the Postal Service on sound financial ground. According to a 2011 report by the Postal Service Inspector General, the Postal Service loses approximately 71 cents for every dollar it spends on Alaska bypass mail. Fiscal year 2010, the Postal Service lost an estimated $73 million on the Alaska bypass mail program. The majority has stated that if enacted, H.R. 4011 would enable additional air carriers to compete for mainline bypass routes, but only after they have been in service for 36 consecutive months. Over and above the 6-month airlines must provide service under current law to even qualify to carry bypass mail. The majority believes that the new market entrants would add competition to the bypass system and reduce the cost borne by the Postal Service. It is unclear why the 36-month standard was set or what its impact would be. Given the high barriers to entry in this market, it is unclear how many airlines would meet the standards set in this bill. It is also unclear what the real impact would be on both bypass and on passenger services provided on planes that carry bypass if new entrants came into the market. The bypass system is extremely complicated. And yet we have not heard from any stakeholders in Alaska who would be affected by changes to the program. In fact, yesterday, Congressman Don Young, who represents Alaska, wrote a letter which has been entered into the record, claiming that passage of H.R. 4011 will undermine successes accomplished by RISA. Shares of mail will be diluted amongst multiple carriers. The market pressures will invite the operation of smaller, less efficient carriers and necessitate multiple stops. This will increase the operating costs of the Postal Service, and these costs will ultimately be passed along to consumers and taxpayers. The Inspector General's report certainly raises many important questions about bypass operations, but H.R. 4011 fails to address the substantive recommendations raised by the Inspector General. For example, the Inspector General raised questions about the system by which rates are set in the bypass program. Currently, the Postal Service is unable to negotiate rates with any of the airline carriers. Instead, the Department of Transportation establishes the charges under a complex system based on input from existing carriers providing bypass service. According to the IG, this cost-based rate system, which essentially permits airlines to pass their costs directly on to the Postal Service, fails to provide any incentive for airline carriers to lower their costs. Mr. Chairman, given the responsibility of this committee to investigate and oversee the matters before us, I think it would be important for this committee to hold a hearing on the Alaska Bypass Mail Program before we rush to pass legislation that may have unintended consequences. Congressman Young also urged that we thoroughly examine the implications of the changes proposed by H.R. 4011. In addition, given the urgency of putting the Postal Service on sound financial footing, I believe we should be considering legislation that actually will address the Postal Service's long-term financial challenges. So I will offer an amendment at the appropriate time to do just that.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, of course.
I join with you in many of those concerns. A piece of history that the committee may not be aware of, when the late Senator Ted Stevens originally did the bill, he held no hearings. He produced it and put it out in spite of the fact that it locked out existing carriers who were already competing in the market. That is to a great degree the reason that I felt that it was appropriate to have this very, very minimal bill which simply opens up competition. Granted, it leaves this 3-year window, and I'm perfectly willing to reduce that 3-year window, but I'd like to do it in concert with Congressman Young if it goes to the floor in that format. Having said that, I want to pledge to the gentleman we have an additional bill which we are working on, which we'll share with you this week, which instead of being 1 page is about 22 pages that relates to further specifics on bypass mail. And I share with you that bypass mail is complex and would require additional work. Additionally, as we pledged when we passed broad postal reform, I intend to bring that to the floor and would, in most cases, entertain asking the Rules Committee, joining with the gentleman, to ask the Rules Committee to make in order some of the amendments that I understand you are going to make us aware of today. So I think when we look at postal, there's at least 3 bills now. One we passed, today's bill, and there will be a broader, more comprehensive one that will deal with some of the cost generators of bypass mail.
On the bypass mail issue, because it is so complicated, Mr. Chairman, is it, can we have a brief hearing on it so that the members will have the benefit?
I'm perfectly willing to hold a hearing on it. It is complex.
It's different, and it's different. I mean, it's mail that's not mail.
It's you know, Elijah, you know, we don't often get into this colloquy, but I think it's important for all the members to understand that in my visits to Alaska, in the role in this committee of trying to understand basically the fact that in Alaska we carry air freight at an incredible discount, about 1/3 the price of freight in the next pallet over on the same aircraft, and the ratepayers throughout all 50 states eat that discount. It is complex. One of the interesting things is that in our bill, the one that already has passed the committee, we reduce the discount that they get so that they at least pick up 40% of the cost. And that is unilaterally opposed by all Alaskans because it might cause them to pick up 40% of the cost of their freight. So some things we're not going to easily resolve. Alaskans would like to have their freight delivered as inexpensively as possible. One of the challenges is in every other state we can say we'll have it delivered by road. Alaska is one place in which most people receiving bypass mail have no road, at least during some part of the year, and in some cases have no sea during most or all of the year. So I would work with the gentleman to schedule a hearing so that people could be, or a briefing, in order for people to understand a small but pretty expensive program that the Post Office eats by billing all of us as ratepayers, whether it's the gentlelady from New York or Baltimore. We're all paying for cans of Coke and milk being delivered to rural locations in Alaska.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Does any other member wish to speak on the bill?
Chairman.
Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the Chairman's opening remarks where he advised members to become familiar with the details and the complexities of bypass mail. But the way we usually do that is by having a substantive hearing. So in addition to the briefing, we would also have the opportunity to bring witnesses up here and would be able to go back and forth and really get into the issue. So that hasn't happened here. We're at a markup already on this. So I would just support the ranking member's request to have a full hearing, a substantive hearing, one with witnesses where we'd be able to test the arguments, because I have a letter here from Don Young. It's the only testimony we've got on this issue, and we certainly need more. The other thing is, I think that if you look at every state in the Union, there's some aspect where they're getting an advantage. And Alaska is a special place, and the folks in Alaska have special challenges. And I would prefer to treat them as Americans as opposed to, a state that might be getting an advantage on mail delivery because of the remoteness of their location. And, I just think we could try to be fair to them and fair to our taxpayers in the other states as well, by coming up with some type of, I don't know, some compromise, some balanced approach, rather than simply, condemning them for the advantage that they have right now. We've got to figure something out. They do have unusual challenges, and maybe we try to figure out how to help them rather than, take away the support that they've been getting so far.
Gentleman yield.
I do.
I want to be very clear. I know that in various states, people face all kinds of challenges, and I agree with the gentleman. I want this is in no way to take something away from Alaskans that may be in very, very difficult circumstances. But I agree with the gentleman. I think it's first and foremost, I think it's important that we understand exactly what the concept is, number one. And number two, I think with that understanding, hopefully it will give us the basis to do exactly what you just said, that is to try to come up with a solution that makes sense and is fair to our fellow citizens in Alaska. And so I just want to yield back to the gentleman.
All right, reclaiming my time. I appreciate the gentleman's remarks and his leadership as well. If you look at, people would look at Louisiana and say, well, goodness, they've got all kinds of flood relief and all that, and some people might perceive that as being overly generous to Louisiana, but those are Americans. They've got some special challenges down there. I think it calls upon us to act as Americans and not simply as parochial representatives of our own district. The other thing that I think is a gaping hole in this whole process is that we really haven't brought in the Postal Service to really give us a broad assessment of how they see this issue. And
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure I would.
I share the gentleman's concerns. It's the reason that we broke the bypass mail, if you will, legislation into two pieces. The part that had nothing to do with bypass mail and had everything to do with locking out competition hadn't had a hearing and was done many years ago in support of, if you will, certain established carriers. What we did, though, what we will do is the remainder of the bill, and it's fairly extensive.
Can I just reclaim my time here, and I appreciate that. Look, because Ted Stevens didn't have a hearing, that was wrong. And so now we're not going to have a hearing. And that's equally wrong. So, as my mom would say, two wrongs don't make a right. So how about we go back to regular order where we actually bring witnesses in and have an informed decision on both sides? Dear God, I'm likely to agree with you at the end of the day once we have a hearing. But at this point, I've got very little to go on. So just from a procedural standpoint, I have to oppose your bill. I have to oppose this markup because we haven't had a hearing on it. And I just think that, that's the wrong road to go on, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Does anyone else members will have 5 days in which to make additional comments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment?
I have an amendment, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4011, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection. For what gentleman's?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order against the gentleman's amendment.
Gentleman reserves.
Thank you very much,
Gentleman
Mr.
from
Chairman.
Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, our committee should be working to place the Postal Service on sound financial footing by enacting comprehensive reform legislation. For that reason, I'm offering an amendment that would add provisions from H.R. 2690, the Innovate to Deliver Act, which I introduced last summer. My amendment would create a new Chief Innovation Officer position within the Postal Service, charged with leading the development of products and services that will enable the Postal Service to meet challenging customer demands. My amendment also would authorize the Postal Service to offer a wide range of non-postal products that capitalize on its retail and delivery networks. In a white paper issued on January 27th, the Inspector General reported that the Postal Service could help millions of underserved Americans save money from excessive fees and interest payments while generating billions of dollars of new revenue by offering non-banking financial services. According to the Inspector General, in 2012, underserved Americans spent approximately $89 billion on interest and fees for alternative financial services. I can testify to that because I live in such a neighborhood. The Postal Service could generate almost $9 billion in new revenue if just 10% of that expenditure was made at the Postal Service. Underserved Americans also would benefit if they could access a wider range of financial services as postal retail locations. According to the Inspector General, if access to financial services through the Postal Service decreased bankruptcy filings by just 5%, more than 50,000 people would avoid the devastating consequences of bankruptcy. The Postal Service does not need to compete with current financial services providers to expand its range of financial products. Many of those who could benefit by accessing financial services at the Post Office are not currently served by the banking community. The Postal Service has 35,000 post offices, stations, branches, and contract units, give it a reach that the banking industry simply has not chosen to provide. According to the Inspector General, 59% of post offices are in zip codes with one or no bank branches. The Inspector General's report also describes a number of ways in which the Postal Service could partner with existing financial services providers, which would benefit both the financial services sector as well as the Postal Service. Mr. Chairman, I previously included the Chief Innovative Officer language in Chairman Issa previously included the Chief Innovative Officer language in his postal reform legislation, which I appreciate, that the committee marked up in July. There is absolutely no reason why Congress and the Postal Service should not work together to put the service on a path to a sustainable future by authorizing it to provide products and services that meet customers' needs. Finally, the Postal Service recently announced its financial results for the first quarter of fiscal year 2014. If not for the pre-funding requirement, the Postal Service would have made more than $1 billion. This result shows that it is imperative for the committee to address the pre-funding issue facing the Postal Service. Both Chairman Issa and I have legislation that would grant the Postal Service a reprieve from the $5 billion pre-funding payment it is mandated to pay each year until 2016. Both Chairman Issa and I believe that the Postal Service should not have to start a new amortization payment schedule until 2017, giving it 3 years to build its capital reserves. This is one area both sides agree on, and we could easily come together to draft and pass legislation to achieve this common sense reform. I urge the members to adopt my amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida, do you continue to?
Continue to reserve a point of order.
Okay. I'm prepared to rule on the point of order.
Mr. Chairman, on the amendment.
Okay. Well, this side just spoke. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak? Mr. Farenthold.
While I agree that this does not appear to be germane to an Alaska bypass mail, I do want to point out a concern in the amendment should we actually go ahead and debate it. The Post Office operates at a huge competitive advantage in that they're basically tax-free, and we're looking, the amendment specifically names check cashing services, for instance, which does put the Post Office directly in competition with banks for foot traffic. While I understand the ranking member's concern about areas underserved by retail banking facilities, technology is developing solutions to that as more and more checks are being deposited by direct deposit, and those funds are available by unmanned automatic teller machines, and you're very difficult to find a location that doesn't have an ATM at the local convenience store. While I want to, we've worked hard on postal reform and are looking at new ways for the Post Office to make money and to free them up from restraints. Part of the process of doing that is making sure we don't unfairly compete with existing businesses. So I would, in the event that the amendment is ruled germane, which I personally think it is not, I would urge opposition to it.
Gentleman yield just for a moment.
I will.
First of all, I thank you for your sensitivity with regard to underserved communities. There are a lot of them. And innovation doesn't always get it. I mean, I live in a neighborhood in the inner city of Baltimore where I think you'd have to go at least 3/4 of a mile to find a banking institution. What we have is a lot of payday loan folks who are taking advantage of people big time. I mean, big time. And people are drowning literally in debt. But I understand, you know, hopefully we'll be able to find a solution to this problem and also help the Post Office. I think, you know, I spoke to the postmasters yesterday out in Alexandria. They're having some kind of convention. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, I was telling them is that while we want to find ways to allow the Postal Service to be innovative in finding ways to get more income in, it seems like everybody, every time you go, you suggest something, somebody jumps up and says, oh, that's competition with this or that. The banks just have not been where I'm talking about. And if I'd love to see some banks in my neighborhood, but they're not there. And so, again, but I appreciate what the gentleman said.
And reclaiming my time, as chairman of the Postal Subcommittee, I do look forward to working with my ranking member, Mr. Lynch, and the ranking member of the entire committee on this as well. With respect to the proliferation of payday loans, though outside the jurisdiction of this committee, I think part of that may also be the fault of overregulation in the form of Dodd-Frank that I think needs to be addressed elsewhere in this Congress.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will to the chair.
If I could switch back to one thing quickly. For Mr. Lynch and I think others, Bypass mail was in the comprehensive reform. It has been an area of study of this committee. Notwithstanding that, on the unique bypass mail bill that we are working on, which I believe will be broadly bipartisan, and which brings up some new efficiencies that were not in the comprehensive bill we passed earlier this year, there will be a hearing. Again, though, in the case of a question of barring competition, there is nothing in Alaskan, quite frankly, can tell you that would justify the idea that only under the existing law, only existing carriers prior to 2001, and then only by certain categories, are allowed to compete. This effectively, for example, puts Alaskan Air in one category where they carry a great deal and locks out others. I wouldn't have brought this bill except that what has happened is it is and for Mr. Lynch, it is 100% contractor. There are no postal employees involved in this process. But what's happened is that it is a system of preference in which a great many people are carrying the mail but are not eligible for the preference, meaning that you have a system in which you get the higher pay based on the very few competitors, and then whenever they leave something at the dock, you bring in additional items. And this is not, if you will, the float planes and so on. When you see the additional areas that we are going to work on, and Mr. Lynch, I hope to work directly with you on it, we are trying to bring better efficiency for the Alaskan, particularly the Alaskan native. Lastly, and I am over the gentleman's time and I appreciate the indulgence, one of the challenges we are dealing with the legacy of Senator Stevens' legislation is he fervently believed that postal rates for all 50 states should facilitate passenger travel in Alaska. And we are carefully trying not to, per se, eliminate that preference, but drive down some of the other cost drivers. And in the hearing, I think that's what we're all going to discover is that many of the rules were designed to guarantee that you had to have seats and carry passengers in order to carry the mail. And in this case, where it's air freight, it sometimes works to the detriment of common sense. They're not carrying letters as we know it. They're carrying gas generators and all kinds of other large equipment. So it is complex. Mr. Lynch, I assure you we will have on the core questions that will affect Alaskans, we will have a hearing, and I think you'll be very satisfied. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
On the amendment?
And now I get to recognize Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just going to your point, I would like a hearing on all the issues affecting this issue, which is, the bypass mail issue. So right now, the way you're handling it, we're having a hearing of one. You're the one witness, and we don't get to, get evidence or testimony from anybody else. So that's sort of, hijacking this whole process rather than having witnesses and briefings and being able to test the testimony of witnesses and get at their veracity and accuracy. We're instead put in a position where we've got to accept what you say, and that's not what I signed up for. Number one. So I would still insist upon the regular order of what we do here, how we make decisions, having an informed hearing and witnesses both for and against, and handle it that way. And let's let the facts permeate this process. Going back to the gentleman's amendment, the ranking member's amendment, I'd like to express my strong support for the amendment offered by Mr. Cummings. I think his thoughtful amendment is based largely in his earlier introduction of the Innovate to Deliver Act. He introduced that back in July. And quite similar to 2690, this amendment seeks to enhance the financial viability of the United States Postal Service without compromising delivery standards or unfairly burdening our dedicated postal workforce and retirees. And in particular, Mr. Cummings' amendment would encourage the Postal Service to develop innovative products and services that fall in line with the emerging information technology. This effort would take place under the responsible management of a new Chief Innovation officer charged with ensuring that any new product and service must be maximized with respect to revenue to the Postal Service. Let me also note that similar to the Innovate to Deliver Act, this amendment recognizes that we can take common sense steps to reform in the United States Postal Service for the better that do not entail the elimination of key customer services such as 6-day delivery and door-to-door delivery. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote in favor of Mr. Cummings' amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to our discussions, I ask unanimous consent. That is my discussion with you. I ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
The gentleman's amendment is withdrawn. For the record, I've agreed to have a hearing both on Chief Information Officer and on particularly on what I would consider, I guess, Senator Elizabeth Warren's proposal for banking and other services, and I think it's very worthwhile for us to begin looking at those questions.
And don't forget my bill, the Chief Innovative Officer.
Oh, the Chief Innovation. Actually, I want you to submit that as a separate bill so we can move it on suspension.
Very well, very well. Say that a little bit louder.
I want you to bring it as a separate bill so we can move it on suspension without further hearing.
Very nice.
Okay. Are there any further amendments? If there's no further discussion, I move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report H.R. 4011 to the House with the recommendation it do pass. The question is on favorable reporting H.R. 4011 to the House. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment, the motion is agreed. H.R. 4011, the Alaskan Bypass Fair Competition Act, is ordered reported to the House. And I think we have time for the last one. We could get through them all. We will be switching at 10 o'clock, so let's see if we can get through the last one. The committee will now consider H.R. 2804, the All Economic Regulations and Transparency Act of 2013. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2804, a bill to amend Title V United States Code to require the Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs to publish information about rules on the Internet and for other purposes.
Without objection, H.R. 2804 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Collins.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the desk in nature of a substitute.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2804, offered by Mr. Collins of Georgia.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text is already distributed and is in each of your folders. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized briefly to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply makes technical changes in the bill, and I would urge its adoption. I would like to take just a moment to talk about the bill in general. H.R. 2804, the All Economic Regulations or Transparent Act, or also known as the ALERT Act, is a great piece of legislation that will provide for regulatory certainty to the American people. The common sense piece of legislation requires transparency and accountability from Federal agencies so that they cannot impose new regulations in the dark of night. Currently, regulatory transparency is lacking. Small businesses, citizens, and advocacy groups must rely on agency annual regulatory plans or the semi-annual unified agenda to prepare for upcoming regulations. However, under this administration, deadlines for issuance of these regulatory transparency planning tools have been delayed or skipped entirely, leaving citizens in the dark. Without regulatory transparency, the public is unable to evaluate or prepare for agencies' anticipated regulatory activities that cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Last year alone, this administration published $112 billion in net regulatory costs. In the last 4 years, regulatory costs have approached $500 billion. The ALERT Act requires monthly updates so that the public will have an up-to-date information about anticipated regulatory activity, providing the opportunity for meaningful participation in the regulatory process, and to ensure that this administration and future administration do not shirk their responsibility, as has been the case. The ALERT Act prevents regulations from going into effect unless the monthly updates have been submitted for at least 6 months. The ALERT Act provides accountability, transparency to our regulatory state. We cannot allow small businesses around the country to be caught off guard by the whims of new regulations whether it's health care, workplace, or labor regulations that affect everyday businesses. It's not only fair to allow citizens ample notice to comment on rules and regulations before they're agreed upon, but it also allows them to adjust their practices before the new regulations take effect. I'd like to thank the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, for offering this important piece of legislation and look forward to its passage. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I oppose this legislation. For the last 3 years, we've seen repeated attacks by House Republicans on public health, safety, and environmental protections. This bill is another attack on agency rulemaking that is being mischaracterized as improving transparency. This bill would prevent a rule from taking effect until certain information is posted online for at least 6 months. The only way to get around this requirement would be if the President issues an executive order. This is an unnecessary roadblock and effectively a moratorium on rules. Just one example of a rule that could be affected by this bill is the Food and Drug Administration's proposed rule establishing sanitary transportation practices for food shippers. This rule was proposed on February 5th in response to several incidents in which people were sickened as a result of unsanitary practices used to transport food. Under this bill, this food safety rule could not be finalized until the information required under this bill had been posted online by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs for 6 months. This includes information such as the status of the rulemaking. Like other agencies, FDA already details the status of its rulemaking and provides extensive amounts of other information about proposed rules on the website regulations.gov. Under this bill, information would have to be posted by OREA, not the agency, for 6 months. In the example of FDA's food safety rule, OREA failed, if OREA failed to post a required piece of information, FDA could not finalize the rule unless the President stepped in and issued an executive order. It should not be that hard for agencies to protect us from salmonella. Many of the disclosure requirements in this bill are also redundant with current requirements. Agencies already publish regulatory plans twice a year, laying out their plans for rulemakings. This bill would require agencies to provide monthly updates to their regulatory plans. This is unnecessary and would tax already stretched agency resources. The Coalition for Sensible Safeguards sent a letter last week opposing H.R. 2804. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to put this letter in the record.
Without objection.
The Coalition wrote in their letter, and I quote, "This bill will impede the government's ability to implement new public health and safety protections in a timely manner," end of quote. The Coalition goes on to say, and I quote, "CSS has long advocated for improving the transparency of the Federal rulemaking process. Unfortunately, the requirements of the ALERT Act of 2013, which would delay important public protections and waste scarce government resources, fail to provide needed transparency improvements in the regulatory review process." Mr. Chairman, H.R. 2804 is not a good bill. I oppose it, and I urge my colleagues to do so. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Members will have 5 days in which to record additional opening statements. Are there any amendments? Mr. Woodall.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2804, offered by Mr. Woodall of Georgia.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is a straightforward amendment that says, to the degree that the economic impacts of the proposed rule have been considered, that those findings should also be disclosed. I would hope that we're always talking about the economic impacts. In particular, my amendment mentions job creation and what the impact would be on America's job market. And if those concerns have not been considered during the rulemaking process, the amendment would simply require a certification that no consideration of economic impacts or jobs was made. And with that, I'd ask for the committee's support. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Cummings.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. It would require agencies to report on the net effect of any rule on job creation. This amendment adds another reporting requirement on agencies without fixing the problems in this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman, Mr. Woodall. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments? If there's no further discussion, no further amendments, the question now appears on
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to...
the gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I was surprised that the majority came forward with this act. The executive order is already so extensive that it's hard to...
Would the gentlelady pull the mic a little closer, please, for the record?
I said I was surprised that the majority came forward with this bill. Particularly considering how extensive the executive order, which goes back to the 1990s, already is. Summary of the action, legal deadline, legal authority, regulatory plan. Then there's the Regulatory Flexibility Act. There's been a great deal of work done. If anything, the great issues go to how long it takes for the rulemaking process to proceed and become final. That has been a very significant problem. Anyone who is affected has a virtual agenda to follow the rulemaking process in the existing regulations. It's amazing to see in a committee that's supposed to reduce paperwork, simplify government, to see a paperwork bill like this, and it is hard to believe it has any objective except to delay the final rule, going to come out anyway, but is going to have an adverse effect upon the health and safety of the American people.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I'd be glad to yield to the
Thank
gentleman.
you. I share with the gentlelady her concerns, though in looking at the bill as written, the nature of the executive order is far different than a typical executive order because it lays out the specific basis under which a president may claim the need to expedite. For example, in number 2, which the president determines by executive order should take effect because the rule is necessary because of an imminent threat to health or safety or other emergencies. The executive order, in my opinion, and I hope that we can all agree on this, would be almost a canned executive order where he would simply have to sign in order to waive it and use that. And a good
we're claiming my time. I don't know if this bill comes forward because of allegations that the President, and this goes back to President Clinton, has abused his executive order authority, but I didn't hear that. And absent a compelling need, anyone who knows anything about rulemaking, the part of this bill that would have you report on the monthly status, is amazingly redundant. Rulemaking, for example, will involve months where lawyers will have to debate among themselves just words, one word, 2 or 3 words. The notion of having to come back each month and say we're on the same 2 words we were on the month before is going to anger a public, perhaps, who wants you to just slide right over those words and get it done. But, of course, what we're doing here is keeping the agency from getting it done by keeping tabs on nothing, keeping tags on running water, drip by drip. So I do not see that any need has been in describing this bill, the authors have not indicated the compelling need for this regulation.
Would the gentlelady further yield?
I'm glad to yield.
I thank the gentlelady. Just as one member of Congress, what I might ask us all to remember is that rulemaking is by definition lawmaking, that we delegate rulemaking, which means we delegate.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, not only is it by definition lawmaking has been held so by the Federal courts, we can change any rule we want to. After the rule is out, Congress can overrule the rule in its entirety. If we don't like the rule, delaying the rule will not keep the rule from coming out. So if you don't like the rule, Mr. Chairman, come forward in this committee or the appropriate committee with a way to overcome the rule. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. If there is no further discussion, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor?
Can I have like 30 seconds, please?
The gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. While I agree with the minority about the concerns about the paperwork, the real solution to this problem and the devastating impact some of these bills have is the REINS Act that's waiting for action over in the Senate. In the meantime, we need to do what we can to remind bureaucrats of the devastating economic and jobs impact some of these regulations might have.
20 seconds. If there is no further discussion, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? No.
Recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
But let me finish this part. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it.
Recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote on the amendment is ordered and will be postponed to after the hearing. And I would announce for all members that your offices will be contacted if it is any time other than at the conclusion of the first round of votes. The intention of the Chair is that we will go through the hearing, and we will then, upon the first round of floor votes, convene immediately following those floor votes. So I would ask all members, after you vote on the floor later today, after the hearing, after you vote on the floor, please come here for an anticipated vote on this amendment and final passage of the bill. With that, I would—
Mr. Chairman, just one thing.
Of course.
I asked the Chairman that just so that members, for the convenience of members, so that I know members have all kinds of things to do, I hope that we can try to stick to that we come back right after those votes and get it done, no matter what, because it's going to be a short vote. So members can
I find no, unless there is something that arrives that we agree to and thus inform your offices, that's